Hello, greetings from sunny Chicago, and thank you all for joining us. I am Sebastian Burka, the Senior Associate Director of the Stigler Center, and today we are happy to host a conversation on the political economy of China's zero COVID strategy with Yanzhong Huang, Xuefei and Dali, moderated by Amy Chin. We are especially excited to have this opportunity to host three UChicago affiliated scholars among our speakers today. And this conversation is the third installment in our series on China's political economy, where we feature scholars and experts discussing the country's changing political economy environment and the potential domestic and international implications. You can watch the videos of the previous events on our YouTube channel. But before we begin, please note, we are on the record and we will also post this event video on our YouTube channel later. If you have questions for the speakers, we will address them in the last 25 minutes or so, and you can submit them via the Q&A icon at the bottoms of your screens. As usual, views expressed by our guests are their own, not those of the Stigler Center or the University of Chicago. And we hope that you will join us for more upcoming events in the new academic year. So please check our website for upcoming details, as well as our publication from market.org, and subscribe to our Capitalism podcast. The relevant links can be seen in the chat function at the bottom of your screens. And now please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Yanzhong Huang is Professor and Director of the Center for Global Health Studies at Seton University and a Senior Fellow for Global Health at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has written extensively on global health governance and public health in China, among others, and he holds a PhD from UChicago. Xuefei is an associate professor of sociology at Michigan State University, where she researches health, environment, and migration topics. She has written several books on Chinese cities and is currently working on a few projects, including one on the role of experts in China's COVID-19 response. She also holds a PhD from Chicago. Dali is William Claude Reavis Professor and Senior Advisor to the President and the Provost on Global Initiatives at UChicago. He is the author of numerous books and works on China's politics, political economy, and their global implications. His current projects include China's public health crisis, regulation, environmental governance, and state-society relations, among others. Professor Yang has also served in various academic and leadership roles, including as the founding faculty director of the UChicago Center in Beijing. And last but not least, our moderator today is Amy Chin. She is an international correspondent for the New York Times, covering the intersection of culture, politics, and society in China. For 8 years, she was based in Beijing, and her reporting has taken her from the front lines of the COVID epidemic in Wuhan to the anti-government protests in Hong Kong. In 2020, she was on the team that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And now, without further ado, I turn it over to Amy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sebastian, and thanks to everyone for being with us today. We have a really great panel lined up to talk about what has just been one of the most fascinating news topics for the last 2.5 years now. It's hard to imagine. This all began 2.5 years ago in Wuhan. And at the time, I remember a lot of people thinking, how is China going to get this under control? Is this going to be a major political crisis for China? And, in the end, we saw that they did get the virus under control, even as other countries were flailing, and they were able to really keep the economy going while other countries were struggling. Then Omicron hit. I'm skipping over a lot of history here, but just top level, Omicron hit. And I think basically we've seen that as the virus has become more transmissible, it's really put China's zero COVID strategy to the test. In the best of scenarios, it's worked really well, like we saw at the Beijing Olympics. In the worst of scenarios, we see what just happened in Shanghai, where basically China's largest city was put under a very strict lockdown, where we saw food shortages, overwhelmed hospitals for 2 months. So even though it seems like we're coming out of that now, I think that this panel today, hopefully we'll be talking about many different aspects of the zero COVID strategy and trying to get at the question, is this a new era for China? Is this zero COVID policy here to stay? Can the pandemic really be over if China doesn't move on from the pandemic? So I'd like to start today with Yanzhong, and then we'll have 5-minute remarks from each of our panelists. Then we'll go into a discussion between us, and then we will open it up for Q&A at the end, about 25 minutes. And feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box at any time. So Yanzhong, if you wouldn't mind kicking us off.
Sure. Thank you, Amy. Thanks, Sebastian, also for inviting me to speak this event. It's always good to be back, even though it means virtually to Chicago. Yeah, so when we talk about zero COVID, for those who don't know what zero COVID is, right? Basically, that is the policy, that become popular since spring 2020, after the situation was under control in Wuhan and elsewhere in China. So on that policy, basically even like a very small number of cases could immediately trigger mass PCR testing, aggressive contact tracing, quarantine, and isolation measures, right? And if needed, even sealing of the entire cities, right? So the objective was to secure the so-called hard-won achievements, right? China has made, right, in the fighting COVID in Wuhan, and also maintain a COVID-free environment. In the meantime, they want to use that strategy to buy time for mass vaccination so that China could achieve the so-called herd immunity, right? Initially, as Amy has to say, but it worked well, right? There was a low level of infection, actually extremely low level of infection, very few severe cases, mortality was extremely low, especially when you compare it to the United States, right? So the government touted the superiority of the so-called China model, its political system, right? Beginning summer 2021, with the arrival of the Delta variant, right, in Nanjing and Yanzhong, right, the Southeast China, was some sort of like a wake-up call on the sustainability of that approach, right? There was diminishing returns problem, and according to Zheng Guang, a leading public health expert, it becomes 10 times more difficult to implement the policy. So they redefined the objective to so-called societal zero COVID. Basically, as long as zero cases are found by in the unquarantined communities, it's considered a success in achieving zero COVID. So even with the highly transmissible Delta variant, China is still able to bring the situation under control. Actually for all of 2021, it reported only 2 COVID deaths, right? And in the meantime, mass vaccination rollout went very well, right? Nearly 90% of the Chinese received the 2 doses of the inactivated vaccines, right? But all this, as Amy again said, all this changed after March, right, this year, with the arrival of the Omicron wave, which we know Omicron is highly transmissible. It's mostly asymptomatic, right? So it's very difficult to detect, track, and keep the virus at bay. So the government had to double down on efforts, right, since the end of the March, right, to implement that approach. That, of course, in Shanghai led to the tragic consequences. The economy now is in the free fall, right? Social discontent rise to an unprecedented level, over the past 3 decades. And this week, what the government said, it has stamped the large outbreak in Shanghai and also prevented a similar one from emerging in Beijing. But also the same week, right, that it reimposed a certain lockdown in Minhang, right, one of the districts there that with 2 million people there. And since last Thursday, I think this Thursday, the 3 districts in Beijing have ordered entertainment venues, bars, they are to close until further notice. So you could tell why this policy seems to become self-defeating, right? They want to avoid mass die-off. They want to avoid, the spike of cases to overwhelm China's healthcare system, right? But all this requires China to try to invest in such capacities to educate the people about the risk of posed by COVID, to prioritize the elderly in vaccination. But for 2 years, more than 2 years, right, there's no serious efforts, investment being made, expanding the capacity to treat severe cases. They are still highlighting the danger of Omicron, even though it's become much less severe, right? and mass PCR testing quarantine measures now essentially siphon off by the resources from vaccination campaign. So by the end of May, right, of the 264 million Chinese aged over 60, 36% or nearly 100 million have not received a booster shot, right? Which we talk about booster shot because it's important, right, to reduce severe cases and death, right? But despite this, right, still, right, China, the government insists on continuing zero COVID, right? President Xi, in his recent trip in Sichuan, called on the government to adhere unwaveringly, right, to its zero COVID policy. So in a way, that policy also, I found interestingly, it's also become self-fulfilling, right? Because the policy shield the population from COVID, and because of the low efficacy rate of the Chinese vaccines and the relatively low vaccination rate among the elderly, for the fear, right, that there could be millions of hospitalizations and deaths, right, if relaxing the country's zero COVID strategy actually makes zero COVID justifiable itself, right? So we are seeing these efforts to routinize zero COVID measures, not just in large cities like Shanghai, Beijing, but also in Henan, which has like 100 million people, right? So, to quickly wrap up, right? That policy by its, China basically is rapidly losing its battle, right, to achieve zero COVID goals, but the significant policy relaxation may not occur even after the 20th Party Congress in the fall. So with that, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Yanzhong. That was really interesting and great overview. I wonder if we could turn now to Dali. You've been analyzing the politics behind the pandemic, and it's obviously this is a really interesting year for China politically, with Xi sort of set to take this unprecedented third term. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the politics of the zero COVID policy right now, and especially what we're seeing recently also with Li Keqiang, the premier, trying to sort of jumpstart the economy after now seeing kind of what the effects have been.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. Great occasion to reflect on some of those developments. It's just as I was hearing Yanzhong, I was also thinking in many ways how lucky China was, or the world was actually in 2003 when there was SARS, right, which was actually relatively quickly contained. And of course, also at the same time, how lucky the situation was in Wuhan at that point. As well, despite the glitches, the delays in final response. The fact of the matter was, however, that in early 2020, Xi Jinping took actually sort of charge of the situation by January 20th or so, and decided in the end around actually January 22nd, decided to impose the lockdown on Wuhan, a city of 10 million people. In that sense, actually, what happened in China demonstrates the capacity of the Chinese party state, the kind of hierarchy nationally, the ability of the national leadership, for example, to impose on such sort of a city. And in that case also that to the extent that China became very successful, then they could utilize that system together with PCI testing, which actually became much more widely available. And of course, a regular mechanism actually sort of for such sort of testing and controls to apply it, as Yanzhong mentioned, for example, that became actually sort of the basis for dynamic zero COVID. And gradually that policy also became broadened a little bit. Part of the reason was, as you emphasized, zero COVID actually was integrated with orderly economic development. Xi was adamant about it. He basically decreed or ordered that we have to integrate. A way means actually China and the Chinese leadership have to be able to integrate socioeconomic development and dynamic zero COVID. And in the process, they also began to experiment with, for example, precision targeted, in fact, zero COVID, especially in Shanghai. The problem, however, was that the more they tested, the more they were also testing fate, really. So sort of because, of course, the virus became more contagious, especially with Omicron, especially earlier this year. And in that case, actually, by the time they finally figured it out, actually experts in Shanghai were still wondering at the end of March, oh, why are cases still increasing at such a rate, despite the fact that, oh, we were doing all this testing and so on, in fact, at that point. And it's also at that point, the national leadership came in and said, well, you guys, you have actually really forgotten the fundamental mission is zero COVID. It's not about experimenting, testing, precision targeted controls, and so on. So in the end, in this case, actually, so sort of what we find, therefore, is the mobilization, again, of the system under Xi's leadership to do the kind of controls. And of course, currently in Shanghai, again, they were able to bring the cases down. But of course, as Yanzhong has also emphasized, it's very challenging to prevent a small number of cases from coming back. But those cases, again, because it's so contagious, have to be controlled. And of course, frequent testing has become such a drag on the lives of so many. And of course, in many ways, what we find, therefore, is actually sort of a leadership very committed to a policy that has been successful until recently. And the cost, however, of such policies have risen dramatically. It also pays the economy increasingly against zero COVID as a result. It also pays the people who are in very secure positions, especially in government and so on, against those people who have especially service-oriented jobs, especially in the service sectors. It also pays against the relatively older, for example, retirees and on fixed income, on guaranteed incomes and government positions against people who are trying to get into the job. This year, for example, more than 10 million people are joining the, in fact, graduates are joining the labor force, but there are very few jobs because the economy has been down. And there are actually sort of tremendous challenges, therefore, and especially because other regulatory policies in China have also brought the job prospects down as well. So in this circumstances, this is what China's leaders are trying to manage. They did introduce a double insurance policy last year. Namely, they wanted to couple very high vaccination rates with zero COVID, hoping and knowing that actually if it becomes out of control, difficult to control, people are vaccinated. But there is a paradox to it. The paradox is the more you vaccinate, the less, there are fewer symptoms for the people who are vaccinated, and therefore it becomes even harder to control. And that's the paradox China faces, especially as the rest of the world has moved on.
Thanks so much, Dali. Yeah, you brought up a lot of really interesting points that I think we'll get into later on in the discussion as well. But first, I'd like to turn to Xuefei, who has been doing some really fascinating work looking at the way that cities around the world have responded to the virus. And I was wondering if, Xuefei, you might be able to help us put China's response into a global context and also kind of give us a better feel of what it actually looks like on the ground in China's cities.
Sure. Well, good morning, everybody. So I think I will talk about the lockdowns. I'm an urban sociologist. I study cities, but I haven't been back in China for 3 years. So actually, I don't know what's happening on the ground, but I can give you a brief, comparative perspective. So China is not the only country that has used lockdowns to curb infections. If we look back in early 2020 and even in the spring of 2021, a lot of cities around the world used or imposed some form of lockdowns to curb infections. So in that regard, there's nothing Chinese about lockdowns. However, the way lockdowns are implemented in China are very different from what we see in other countries or in cities in other parts of the world. So basically, China has been relying on four things to make the lockdowns very strict and very effective. The first thing is low-tech physical barriers, such as roadblocks or locking up residential gates to residential neighborhoods. And the way Chinese cities have been built in the last 40 years is really conducive to that type of closed management. So most urban residents in China today live behind gates. So they live in gated communities. If you lock the gates, then that's super effective to keep people inside. Of course, some people can jump over, but very few do that. And the second method is high-tech surveillance, such as 健康码, the health app people install in their iPhones or other phones. So if you have a red barcode and if you go out, then the local police officers can quickly identify where you are and then take you, either ask you to go back home or take you to some detention centers. So that's high-tech surveillance. And the third is social surveillance or neighborhood surveillance. In some cities, it's called grid management system, 网格化管理. So this is fascinating for me as an urban scholar. So the neighborhoods in China, urban neighborhoods, have been very busy. Over the last 2 years, 2.5 years, the Chinese government has really extended its reach into the neighborhood. So there's a lot of people from different units at work. There are people from street committee, resident committees, and then street offices, from homeowners associations, and also there are police officers, medics from community hospitals, and then there are volunteers, residents who volunteer their time to work in their neighborhoods. So what do? They do all kinds of things. If there are positive cases, then they take people away, send them to quarantine centers. They also help to deliver food because people, if they are under lockdown, they can't go out. So these neighborhood workers help with the food delivery. And also they basically watch residents' every move. For every residential building, there are probably 15, 20 people watching the residents living inside. So this is not new. The system existed before the pandemic, but during the pandemic, I think China has really perfected the system of neighborhood control. And that's something we don't see in most other countries. And correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know any other country who has a similar system of neighborhood surveillance. And the last thing China relies on to make lockdowns very tight, very strict, is surprisingly is people's cooperation. If people don't cooperate, then we would see very different pictures. And by and large, I think ordinary Chinese have been very cooperative for different reasons. For the older people, they know they are vulnerable, so they want lockdown. They want the pandemic to be over soon. And for some people, I was talking to a friend yesterday, and she said she's been locked down for like 5 times already. The first time, she's very angry, very upset. She posted on social media. But by the 5th time, she told me she's used to it. So I think that's also, it's sad, but it's reality. If you do this so often, then people get used to it. They don't complain. they can, if they have enough food, then they can stay in their apartment for 20 days or 21 days. So I guess the bottom line is lockdown is not something unique to China, but the way China implements it, perfects it, is rather exceptional. It really reflects how the government has been governing or managing cities. A lot of these methods pre-existed before the pandemic, but they've been further tightened up or strengthened over the last 2 years. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much. Super interesting. And just your discussion about the neighborhood controls kind of reminds me of, well, the next question that I have is, it's almost a, I don't want to say it's sort of a kind of an out there question. And I remember early on when I had just gotten back from Wuhan and someone asked me on a panel, do you think that the Chinese government really wants to stamp out the virus? And to me, it just seemed like such a stupid question. Like, of course, yes, they want to get cases low and get this under control. But at this point, I'm wondering, what do you see as the end off ramp for this? Like, how does zero COVID end? And now I'm going to answer it a little bit because I think I know some of the answers, which is vaccinations and whatnot. And do you see the Chinese government making progress towards that? And if not, is zero COVID beneficial for them in some way because they're able to sharpen some of these social control measures? Even before the pandemic began, we saw that China was sort of turning more inwards. Are there other things going on here, basically? So multi-part question. Maybe we can start with just what do you see as a sort of off-ramp for zero COVID, and how is the government doing in terms of moving towards that? I don't know if Yanzhong, you want to talk about that? You're on mute.
Oh yeah, I'm happy to give sort of my speculations, because they, as we know, right, this issue, right, when last summer, right, when Huang was asked about the question, right, when China is going to give up zero COVID, he said, "Well, this is not going to continue in the long run, right? As long as the benefits, as long as the cost exceed the benefits, right, China will pivot away from zero COVID." But when he said that, like, he didn't realize that issue of zero COVID itself, right, can be politicized, right? So what Dali can certainly talk about the political logic, but here are the things that when that issue become politicized, it's framed as a competition between two political systems, and they are also tied so closely to top leaders by their own legacy, leadership, even legitimacy, right? All this concern about social economic costs will become secondary, right? So that makes it very difficult to make the predictions, right? And so you have to look to the political logic there. But in the meantime, right, I can think about certain scenarios, that would force China to, or may convince China to give up a zero COVID, right? The one is that way there's like an emergence or spread of even more highly transmissible with subvariant of the virus, right? That in China, solved by the spread of the virus like gangbusters, right? That the existing zero COVID become completely useless, right? Then China had no choice but to lie flat, Tangping in Chinese, right? Well, that means that they have to transition, right, to a new strategy and learn to coexist with the virus. But in the meantime, of this in contrast to that passive strategy, I can think of a more like a proactive strategy. Basically, if China choose to invest more in protecting and prioritizing the elderly in vaccination, especially using more effective, vaccines by the third dose in particular, and having the effective antiviral pills like Paxlovid, available to the population, because currently, even though they have imported like 20,000 the copies of the medicine, and I think they ordered the second batch, but that amount is very small compared to the demand. China has more than 260 million, right? The elderly, well, people who are aged over 60. So having the effective, right, vaccines and antiviral means or therapeutic means available, I educate the people about the true risk of the virus, or the subvariant. And in the meantime, effectively by implementing the triage procedures, so that the people with mild symptoms are not going to use by the hospital services, by that are so that's such a major concern for the government, right? So as long as they're convinced, right, that this mass die-off can be avoided, right? The healthcare system is not going to be overloaded even with spike of cases. They might be more confident, right, in relaxing by the zero COVID. But still, right, you have to give up that zero COVID mentality, because as long as you said we cannot tolerate even mild cases, right, then there's no way, right, that China can move away from that approach.
And has because the elderly vaccinations has been identified, and the effectiveness of the vaccines both of these have been identified as issues for a long time now. And especially in the last few months, as we've seen the economic impacts grow, have we seen the government sort of ramp up efforts to either get elderly vaccinated or maybe even import some of these mRNA vaccines?
Well, that is a great question, right? The U.S. side, to my knowledge, offered mRNA vaccines to China. China basically rejected, right? And there's this BioNTech-Fosun deal, right, that allowed China, right, to buy this 100 million, right, the mRNA vaccines, and also to mass produce that in China. And so far, they have not approved it. And in the meantime, by the efforts to vaccinate the elderly, especially the third dose we talk about here, has not making much progress. I think as the Financial Times just had this chart showing actually since the May, you actually found by the uptake, the vaccination uptake among the elderly actually has decreased. I think in part because of the commitment to zero COVID, but there's basically less shortage of manpower, resources, right, to vaccinate the people in China. And then you talk about this, the antiviral means, therapeutic means, but China claims it has this medicine, right, developed by Tsinghua University. But the problem here is that it's for injection use. So that does not help much in terms of reducing the pressure, right, on the hospital services. And in the meantime, I said they ordered a second batch of the Paxlovid, but to my knowledge, that amount is still very small.
Interesting. Dali or Xuefei, did you have any additional thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I think let me speak to the exit. In fact, most governments have been forced to open, not because they voluntarily they manage the exit in many ways, right? It's a sort of, and for those few societies and governments that really try to manage the exit from lockdowns, it's been very challenging. And those are smaller societies, more developed, have better resources. One of the best, in fact, is Singapore. But Singapore, of course, there have been ups and downs until finally it managed more or less actually to sort of exit from actually the kind of very strict controls. So in that sense, it's very hard for the Chinese leadership to simply say, well, we are simply opening, particularly given the constraints that Yanzhong has mentioned. In my readings, I see, for example, that they practically want a panacea for the illness at this point, and there is no panacea. The mRNA vaccination is not extremely effective at this point in terms of cutting transmission. So in that sense, they feel like even that is not adequate. in many ways. But at the same time, clearly the newer subvariants are becoming even more contagious and so on. And in that sense, actually, increasingly people, I think last year and until very recently, the Chinese leadership really felt like they could integrate economic development and virus control. And that was the demonstration of China's superiority, the superiority of the Chinese system. And they also believed that the others were in decline. So in that sense, actually, it was, so zero COVID was much enjoyable in some ways to have for the Chinese political system until, of course, now the struggle, and therefore they also see the cost. I mean, one thing that we haven't been reading a lot about Shanghai, for example, is that it was in many ways a repeat of Wuhan. And in fact, the national government mobilized many provinces, sent their medical teams, sent testing teams, and sent others as well, including armed police units to Shanghai. 37,000 people were mobilized from around the country. So in other words, it was not just just actually a lockdown. In fact, Shanghai never officially declared a lockdown. It's in fact very much a siege on Shanghai, where actually sort of the residents were put in confinement essentially in their own homes. So in that sense, actually, the cost of the approach have become apparent, and it's very high, not just to Shanghai, but to the neighboring economies. In the truly, so sort of it brought the economy to, in fact, into decline. So in that sense, actually, this is beginning to really force people to think very hard about how to do it. And in fact, so sort of this is also they are trying to ramp up, including actually continued discussions on imports of the mRNA vaccine. And of course, a number of companies have gotten actually licenses to experiment, to enter into clinical trials as well of their own vaccines at this point.
Xuefei, did you want to add anything?
Sure. I mean, I agree with Dali. I think, well, the question is, what is the end point? And I see two parts to the question. One is the economy, and then the second is people's mentality. So for economy, as Dali said, most countries unfortunately reached that point that they realized that the economy could no longer be sacrificed earlier on, probably at some point in 2020. But China has been lucky. The economy was growing very well in the second half of 2020 and for most parts of 2021. But now, if you look at the data, the numbers are not good at all. Especially for the young people, the unemployment rate is very high, 15%. So China is getting very close to the point that they have to choose the economy or zero COVID. The CCP has built its legitimacy for the last 40 years on economic growth. So they can't survive without that. So it would be interesting to see what the government will decide to do in the next few weeks. And the second part is mentality, and I think it's as important as the economy. So the government has been telling people that COVID is really scary, very, very scary, even the Omicron variant. So people took note. I think people in Shanghai are better educated and probably more informed than the rest of the country. So they know Omicron is not as serious as the waves before. But in general, I think that people need to be, they need to know they shouldn't be as scared as they have been. If they don't change their way of thinking about the different variants, that they will not know how to live their normal life again. So, so in that regard, I think information is crucial. China blocks a lot of websites, so there's limited. in how much people know. But unless people change their way of thinking about the pandemic, then I don't think any fundamental change can happen.
Yeah, I would like to drill down on the economy. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, as you mentioned, youth unemployment is at 15. I think I've seen also 18%. You know, we've seen because of these lockdowns, factory workers having to sleep basically in the factories, supply chains completely snarled, logistics chains also tied up. This has been really tough for China's economy, and especially in the last few months. Some of the data, I think the most recent growth rate was 4.8%, and there's skepticism whether or not China will be able to meet its growth targets. I mean, are we seeing any signs that in this, what you call, you know, the economy being pitted against zero COVID, that these concerns about the economy are now winning out? Or do you think that zero COVID will continue to take precedence? This is for any of you who'd like to answer.
Well, let me jump into this then. I think what's interesting, and my co-panelists can all testify to this in many ways, is that on the one hand, the consequences of the lockdown in Shanghai are so large. And yet, what is the lessons that are being taken? And it's not just about Shanghai, it's also about some of the other places. In fact, it's actually, there are many people in China, including in Shanghai, who feel like, oh, Shanghai could have done better by locking down better, and number one, and locking down earlier as well. So in fact, what's striking today is the fact that the leadership is saying, well, you better practice and get better at testing and lockdowns and locking down early. So they want to be better at zero COVID than actually thinking about exiting at this point, and especially ahead of the 20th Party Congress. So I think, in a nutshell, I feel like actually at this point, this is the biggest lesson so far for the leadership, even as the ground balls especially among the quite a number of the elites now and the middle class have become much, actually, so sort of very palpable in many ways.
Yeah, in addition to what Dali said, how they draw, you might think it's the wrong lessons, right, from Shanghai, right? There's also this issue of the incentive structure, right, of the local government officials, right? When, like you're told by President Xi, right, you're held accountable for COVID situation in your locality. But then Premier Li told you that you need to revitalize the economy, right? It's the economy, right? What will be their choice? What be their preference here, right? So I think when the central government or central leaders are sending this mixed signals, right? It enlarges, right? There's sort of these opportunities for strategic disobedience, certainly. But in the meantime, that since they really care about their positions, right? If you can be fired, be sacked if you don't do a good job enforcing zero COVID, right? Even though, right, that you might do a good job, right, promoting local economy, right? I think the choice could be very clear. That would also give zero COVID a life of its own, continue, right?
Yeah, I think there has been a lot of pressure on the local officials. They need to ensure zero COVID. Also, they need to meet the target of job creation. I heard a few days ago, I think after Li Keqiang's speech, then every city, every region, they are formulating targets for job creation to make sure the young college graduates can find jobs. So so the pressure is mounting, it's getting higher and higher, but I don't think the local officials can do both. But what's happening for the last more than 2 years is, I think, first of all, when we talk about the job numbers for the young people, there are two parts, the urban youth and then the rural migrant workers. What China has been doing for more than 2 years is creating job employment opportunities in the countryside so that people don't have to come, the migrants, the youth growing up in the countryside, they don't have to come to look for jobs in cities. So I haven't seen any data yet, but I think that's probably something good, a viable strategy to divert the pressure in large cities.
Could I add?
So, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, to add to Xuefei's point, one of the most striking developments I see, especially in cities that experience those kind of very uncertain, actually enforcement policies in Beijing and Shanghai, is that the people who rely on migrant jobs in those cities are finding it much harder to be employed there. In Shanghai, many of them have left in recent days. In Beijing, in particular, as you remember, many of those people live outside of Beijing. They used to be able to commute, and they find it extraordinarily difficult to commute now. And of course, testing would add to the expenses later on as well. Lockdowns cut into their earnings. So this is actually becoming very difficult for many of those people to migrate, to actually settle or stay in cities when they just don't know. And in fact, in Shanghai, many of the migrant workers were left to the elements during the lockdown. So it was an extremely sad situation.
Great. Well, we've already had some good questions come in, and feel free to continue submitting those. But I'd like to turn to the Q&A portion now. We have a question from Bella Anis. How could we identify the stagflation risk rises and sharp slowdown in growth after the pandemic, especially in agriculture and the commodity industry? Stagflation. Anyone want to talk about that?
Well, certainly at this point, the situation is actually, well, for China, generally, China has not had a serious recession for 30, 40 years. And this is very unusual in many ways in terms of the economic slowdown and, in fact, negative growth in many regions in the country. But at the same time, as we see from the numbers in terms of exports, in fact, in terms of when we think about stagnation, I think it's more about in developed economies at this point. China, though, if you think about it, the reduction in employment and may actually bring downward pressures on some of the costs. And potentially also China, of course, the lower Chinese demand, in fact, for commodities and so on, helps to ease some of the strains. Actually, many of us would remember, for example, recall that when Shanghai went into lockdown, it actually helped moderate oil prices and so on as well. So it's a very complicated situation, of course, that central bankers are watching extremely attentively, and it's very hard. There are so many pieces. Of course, China is only one piece in this regard.
Yeah, I would also like to add, how this continued lockdown could hurt China's export sector, because it used to be a very robust export sector, that boosted China's economic growth. But now with this huge this disruption on the supply chain, and there are other countries already are recovering from the pandemic. The manufacturing capacity has recovered. That is going to have impact on China's export sector, and so it might have to be more reliant on domestic demand, that to boost its economy at a time when that the lockdown measures also have a devastating impact, suppressing the domestic consumption. So that could indeed have profound implications on China's ability to achieve this 5.5% by the annual economic growth rate this year.
I have another question here from Shuqing Chen. As some cities such as Shenzhen and Henan start to experiment with regular 72-hour COVID tests, how likely for it will it become a nationwide policy, and what will be the implications?
Well, yeah, it's well. I will start. Well, Shenzhen was considered sort of like a successful example, right? They implementing this dynamic, zero COVID, because right after, right, they detected just a very small number of cases. They imposed a 1-week lockdown, then but situation was under control. So that gives the strong incentives for localities, right, to rely on this approach, right, in containing the spread of the virus. That it also, right, give this incentives, for localities to routinize, right, the zero COVID, because, right, in order to prevent, right, the virus from returning, you have to keep vigilant, right? To be able to detect, right, the virus, as soon as possible, right? So, that we're seeing Henan, right, that they now routinize, zero COVID, including the PCR testing. But the problem, there's several problems here, right? The first problem is financing, right? And now, especially the central government basically telling them, right, that you can no longer, right, rely on central, fiscal support, right? And you cannot also, tap the money in the health insurance fund, right? You have to rely on local fiscal, right, resources, right? That make it difficult, right? Especially for a place like Henan, right? That doesn't have very strong fiscal capacity to continue funding, right? This routine PCR testing. And in the meantime, when if they right, decided to reduce the frequency of zero COVID testing, of the PCR testing, then it means that it would delay this ability, the ability would delay this process of detecting, right, the cases in a timely fashion, right? So, that would make those more heavy-handed approaches, like lockdown measures, more likely in China.
Well, going back to the question in terms of the nationwide policy, health policy, generally speaking, are based actually or made at the provincial level, or the responsibility of the provinces in many ways. So the center, the National Health Commission, and in this case, the State Council Prevention and Control Mechanism, offer guidances for localities. And they can say, oh, don't do this, don't do that. But local authorities actually have a lot of leeway in deciding what to do. But as Yanzhong has emphasized, there are also increasing constraints on what can be done in many ways. What we find, for example, in the case of Henan, on the one hand, the province generally is large and there are a lot of challenges. But at the same time, especially in the provincial capital, Zhengzhou, which is a big apple assembling plant, operation in many ways, actually there is. They have a very strong mechanism to maintain production, and therefore they do want some good mechanism for detection and so on. So what we are going to see, therefore, is actually there are going to be variations. But of course, as you only need a few weak links in the system, though, for things to go awry. So that's the challenge, and that Yanzhong has already alluded to in many ways. But at the same time, clearly, this is actually an ongoing drama that with all those different pieces, different players joining in.
Great. We have a bunch of great questions, so I'm just going to move on. Lane from Joe asks, would you like to share some ideas regarding the trends of onshore, nearshore, or friendshore under the current COVID-0 policy? As some multinational companies, such as Apple, move part of their supply chains back to the US or Vietnam, would that phenomenon be irreversible? How will that affect China's employment rate in the future? Anyone want to give that a shot?
Well,
yeah, go ahead, Xuefei.
Well, I don't study supply chains, but I think the current structure, the dependency on China is quite entrenched. and that will not change in a short time period. So we will probably continue to see disruptions. A lot of countries, companies are trying to diversify their operations, but still such a large quantity of goods is made in China. So the disruptions are likely to continue, probably.
Yeah, let me build on what Xuefei has emphasized. In many ways, I think it depends on the sector, depends on how strongly embedded the production supply chain is actually in China. Part of China's strength has been that entire supply chains move to China practically in certain sectors. So it's extraordinarily difficult to dislodge those from China. But of course, there are certain sectors that were already moving away from China, including textiles and so on, even before COVID. And therefore, the kind of restraints that exist in China will accelerate the diversion of those sectors out of, actually, certainly in terms of balancing, or for companies to balance their risk across different areas of the world, and not just China. They really want to actually now realize just in case has become actually sort of really the model instead of just on time, and therefore they want to manage the risk. So I think it depends. At the same time, China continues to enhance its competitiveness in certain sectors. For example, electric vehicles is a good example. In those cases, clearly, and also China is managing to maintain production reasonably well, because when Shanghai was down, the Pearl River Delta, the greater actually Shenzhen, Guangdong region in particular, continues to function reasonably well. So there is diversion within China as well.
Yeah, I think overall, right, this lockdown, sustained lockdown, intensify the cause to economically disengage with China, at least partially. But in the meantime, as Dali pointed out, this varies across sectors, right? And for certain sectors, it might be very difficult, right, or time-consuming to relocate the supply chain. And for those, but even for those companies that want to stay, but they still have to have a plan B, right? That they, for example, operating in those closed loop systems, that still won't be able to shield them from this disruption, but this shock, caused by the disruption of the supply chain. So even for them, I think they are also, right, I believe reassessing the China strategies, and not like, that some of the nationalist Chinese scholars have argued that, don't worry, this is just like, temporary, we have, they are all they want, they're going to stay anyway.
Matthew Lemieux asks, I just came back to the USA from Shanghai a couple of weeks ago, and there are a few thoughts, especially among younger Chinese, that wasn't addressed in the talk. Amy asked a question that hinted at this, but specifically, can you elaborate on the likelihood that zero COVID provides hidden political benefits for the government? For example, that the lockdown in Shanghai was extended from 5 days to 2 months because Beijing was trying to take down Lijiang.
Dali?
Well, I could, yeah, well, Yanzhong, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, you go ahead. Maybe you Xuefei too, that because since talk about the young people, right?
Well, certainly, Lijiang had to make a self-criticism. And that self-criticism was actually, Lijiang is the party secretary of Shanghai. In fact, he was previously a chief aide to Xi Jinping in Zhejiang province. So he's truly a follower and loyal supporter and to be relied on by Xi. But Lijiang had to make a self-criticism essentially to the Politburo about what happened in Shanghai. So in that sense, actually clear, it's not because Xi wants to take down Lijiang. It's because what happened, of course, there have been a lot of speculations on to what extent there would actually, so sort of people in Shanghai would be held accountable in there. But among the young people, I think actually what's truly remarkable today is really, number one, they are buffeted by a lot of the trends, including, for example, the crackdowns in the education sectors and so on, plus the fact that increasingly they are chafing under the zero COVID policies. And of course, especially in terms of the employment and so on. So many of the young in China, this is a generation that grew up with increasing prosperity in their entire lives. And suddenly they face this particular situation. So this is causing them, many of them are what are known as little pinks. They are very nationalist, very patriotic in the Chinese context and so on. And now there is a bit more reflection, I think, actually, as they face all those challenges, in fact. But those things change very quickly. I mean, remember, we can all recall back in, let's say, February 2020, so many people were so critical of what was happening. And then by April, there was so much pride in China. In many ways, the effort by the Chinese leadership is to recover that glory and that pride that existed in 2020 and 2021. But of course, they do face the challenges of Omicron in this regard. The other aspect I do want to quickly mention, I'm pretty sure Xuefei has a lot more to add, is that the lockdown policies and the zero COVID policies in general are not helping with fertility, which is also a big concern for Chinese society, for the Chinese leadership. And in that sense, actually, so they're beginning to look at the numbers for divorces for birth, actually, and already they were so concerned. And I think that's becoming a very significant issue, not just in the short term, but also for the long haul.
So would you say that no hidden political benefits from zero COVID?
I don't think actually it's there is a deliberate strategy, but there are a lot of people who accept the idea that the Chinese government is using zero COVID to control Chinese society and so on, and perhaps to use it for a different kind of emergency in the future. I think what has happened is, and I have studied the stability maintenance system in China, is that China developed a set of institutions and mechanisms for maintaining stability that they used for controlling for zero COVID. And the zero COVID in turn reinforced the existing institutions and patterns of behavior. So they are an integrated whole. But this is not, nobody likes this actually in terms of the controls. And just one very simple fact to underscore the point. Xi Jinping, the president and general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, has not left China since January 2020. It's not something that he relishes, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah, I just follow up what Dali said, that this is going to be like something that have huge implications for China's political development, right? Even especially after the COVID is over, right? Because it's all those control mechanisms that Xuefei has described, right, provide a proof of concept, right? How they can effectively control the Chinese society. So I'm sure they're like government officials, as elites, they entertain that possibility that even after in the post-COVID era, these measures could still be used, institutionalized to effectively control the Chinese society. That certainly would cause the major shifting by the state-society relationship, right?
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think many of the measures, policies, and even institutions will survive after the current or the acute phase of the pandemic is over. So, so China has already been changed, and we will see more change to happen.
Yeah, that brings me to, I'm kind of combining two questions, but Jack Krovitz asked, do you have a timeline prediction for when China will release a plan for exiting zero COVID? And Kathy Ga also asks, there was news that some local governments do not have sufficient funds to pay the testing for people. So they don't have to, so they're not forced, seeing testing and they're asking people to pay for the test. Will this be one of the reasons that the zero COVID policy may not be able to last long in the future? So timeline, and do you think that people having to pay for their own testing might be a factor eventually?
Yeah, for testing, actually, this is something I wanted to ask Yanzhong and also Dali. I don't quite understand. So I heard that from next month in July, people in Shanghai will have to pay out of pocket for COVID tests. And the prices have been reduced to maybe 5 RMB per test. In some places, 3 RMB. But it takes time to do a COVID test every 72 hours. So it probably a big burden, especially for the poor. And we will see more discontent. People will not be happy about this. And I want to hear what you think about how sustainable, how viable the frequent testing is.
I think people won't be happy about this because they have to pay out of pocket, right? Those tests, right? Which was free, right? Before that, So I think eventually, whether this policy will continue will hinge upon how this game, right, is played among the three major sets of actors, right? The people, right? Who are essentially why they have to pay a new tax, right, in getting tested, right? And that's going to, they don't know when this is going to end, right? And secondly, what those testing companies, but they are seeing why their profit margin already is shrinking because, as you said, the price is going down for each test. And third, what those governments, right, the central local government is still, right, pursuing that zero COVID, right, this strategy, right? So we don't really, I don't know, I don't have a timeline there when this is going to be over. Initially I was hoping, right, after the Olympic Games, which Amy, you covered, right, Beijing, I thought after Winter Olympics, where they're going to be signal relaxation. That didn't certainly materialize because what happened in Hong Kong, right? This, basically they were so scared, about, the prospect of mass die-off, healthcare system being overwhelmed. Then I thought it would be after 20th Party Congress, but now with this efforts to normalize, even institutionalize many of the zero COVID measures, including building the so-called, this sounds like oxymoron, right? The permanent makeshift hospitals, right, in China, and normalize PCR testing and all these efforts, that it may actually last through, right, 2023. Already they have, delayed or canceled, some of the major events, right, for 2023. So it technically, it could last through 2023.
Let me elaborate a little bit on the testing side first. It's a great question in many ways, actually. There are already different categories of testing. So if you get treated for COVID in China, for example, the testing is always free and will continue to be free, actually, and it's included in the use of the healthcare fund, in fact. So if you travel, for example, into China or elsewhere, if you go for a test, and that's not being free, it's always actually incumbent on the travelers and so on to pay. So in that sense, actually, that would also continue. So what the Chinese central government is saying that if you want to do mandatory mass testing in a city, is a public health expense. Therefore, the government has to pick up that tab. And so that's the issue. And it's a great question in the sense that many local governments actually are running low on fiscal revenue. So in that sense, actually, they were eager to, for zero COVID, they would prefer to test everybody every day practically, but subject to fiscal constraints. And now the central government is coming in to say, well, you cannot use the healthcare fund to do that, and you better come up with the funds if you want to test. So it's actually a very interesting way of, in fact, by the central government to limit the excessive testing. And they actually last night or the day before, the State Council mechanism emphasized that, when you have achieved zero COVID, there is no need to do all this frequent testing. And that's what they have been telling the localities actually. But of course, the goal of localities to be able to identify the first cases. The problem is when you do frequent testing, there are false negatives and false positives as well. And therefore, in fact, there are obvious issues of managing. I have been emphasizing, saying for quite some time that, it's going to be 4 or 5 years for China. I guess now that we are already in the 3rd year, actually, I think initially when I mentioned that, people were very surprised, including some of my colleagues, that I would use such a long timeline. But now that we are already in the 3rd year, so I would continue to stick in with that, but knowing, however, this is really a very dynamic process. It depends on if we are staying with, for example, the Omicron variant, then it actually becomes more predictable in terms of the virus and becomes actually therefore easier to respond on the Chinese side. Of course, if there is a significant mutation that's more contagious, but also at the same time more lethal, clearly the Chinese government would want to adapt to that and would actually double down on preventing it from spreading. So I think, again, there is a contingent dimension. And also it depends on the availability of vaccines and especially, and also the therapeutics as well. If China comes up with their own mRNA vaccines and also therapeutics, of course, they are going to be easier. They find it easier to say, let's rely on those now.
I'm just going to end with one just very broad question. I hope we can get sort of a 1 to 2 line answer from each of our panelists, or at least keeping it to about 30 seconds or so, from Curtis Stone, sort of related to what we were just talking about. With regard to zero COVID, is China setting itself up for failure in the long run? Policy is becoming increasingly costly in many ways, and it doesn't seem like the virus is going away anytime soon. So final thoughts from Yanzhong, Dali, and Xuefei.
Well, as I said, the government is rapidly losing its battle, right, to achieve its zero COVID goals. Now we are seeing, right, that domestically the economy is in trouble. Right? People's discontent is rising. It potentially could, threaten, right, this, the government legitimacy. And internationally, right, there's, reverence of the China model is rapidly actually disappearing. I think for this, they no longer need to really worry that much about, right, this China model posing a threat, right, to the liberal democracy by just looking at how the zero COVID is carried out in China.
Well, I think number one, it depends on how you define failure. Number two, we actually know over the last 2 and 3 years how people are forgiving of governments and so on. So therefore, it is China's leadership. They have a choice and choices actually to make. And if they make changes, they can continue to adapt. And I think we have been very surprised in the past. Many people were surprised by the upheavals and the changes, but in fact, they have shown a capacity to adapt. They are cornered in a way at this point, but of course, I'm not predicting one way or another, actually, so sort of that this is doomed to failure. So sort of, therefore, it is a matter of choice still.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with the Dali. I think failure for the outside is success for those living in the country. And I see a rising wave of nationalism, especially in the young generation. And there will be different new situations. And China, the CCP has been so adaptive. So it would be just interesting to observe what comes next.
Great. Well, I think we're at time. So I just want to thank again our wonderful panelists for sharing your expertise and insights with us today. And thank you to everyone for joining us. And of course, thank you to the Stigler Center for hosting this talk. We really appreciate you coming. I hope you've learned something.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.